The CEO laughed when she saw the tiny repair shop squeezed between two abandoned buildings on the edge of town. She didn't even slow down, just glanced at it through the tinted window of her black SUV, and let out a short, dismissive sound. The kind that carries no malice, because it carries no respect at all. "Men like you survive on scraps," she said, her voice flat and certain, the way a person speaks when they've never once been wrong in their own mind. She drove away without looking back. But what Victoria Hale didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because she had never bothered to look, was that the quiet man standing in the doorway of that battered little shop, wearing grease-stained boots and holding a wrench that had seen a decade of hard use, had once designed the very factory she was in the process of shutting down. He had drawn its blueprints. He had calibrated its machines. He had built the heartbeat she was now preparing to silence. And she had walked past him like he was furniture. Ethan Cole had run his repair shop for 6 years. The sign above the door was faded, the paint chipping at the corners, and the 2 letters of the E had long since lost their backlighting and never been replaced. Inside, the floor was uneven, and the air smelled of machine oil and burnt metal. A smell that most people found unpleasant, but that Ethan found deeply familiar, the smell of things being put back together. His customers were small manufacturers, local contractors, old farmers with aging equipment. People who couldn't afford to lose a single machine for a single day. They came back to him not because his shop looked impressive, but because he never failed them. When a belt press at Miller's grain facility sheared its drive shaft on a Tuesday afternoon, Ethan had a replacement running by Wednesday morning. When a compressor at the Hartfield construction yard seized in the middle of a project, Ethan showed up with a rebuilt unit before the foreman had finished complaining. He did not advertise. He did not need to. His reputation moved quietly through the county the way all real reputations do, from one person's honest word to another's. He lived in a small house 2 streets over from the shop. He drove a truck that was 12 years old and had 140,000 miles on it. He cooked dinner every evening for his daughter, Lily, who was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, which was both a joy and a daily negotiation. Her mother, Claire, had died 3 years earlier from an illness that had moved faster than anyone expected. Ethan had been there for every appointment, every treatment, every quiet and terrible night, and when it was over, he had folded his grief into something dense and internal and gone back to work, because Lily needed a father who was present, and because stillness, for Ethan, had always been harder than labor. He didn't talk about Claire often, but he kept a photograph of her on the workbench in the shop, tucked between a socket set and a coil of wire. And sometimes, when a job went particularly well, he glanced at it and allowed himself a moment that wasn't quite a smile but was something close. The news arrived on a Wednesday. Vantara Industrial Group, the conglomerate that had acquired the Hargrove manufacturing plant 2 years earlier under the leadership of its new CEO, Victoria Hale, had announced the closure of the plant effective at the end of the month. The Hargrove plant had employed over 200 people in the county for nearly 3 decades. It was a landmark, the kind of place that entire families had worked across generations. The closure was described in the press release as a strategic restructuring decision to optimize operational efficiency across the Vantara portfolio. 214 workers would lose their jobs. The plant would be liquidated. Equipment would be auctioned. The facility itself would be sold. Victoria Hale's photograph accompanied the announcement. She looked composed and forward-facing, and utterly unbothered. Ethan read the notice twice, then set it down on the workbench. He was interested not in the politics of the closure, but in the liquidation. Industrial equipment, even second-hand and years out of service, could still be useful. A conveyor system, a set of precision presses, even a calibrated lathe, any of these would be worth far more than their auction price to someone who knew how to restore them. He made a call to the auction coordinator, secured a viewing appointment, and drove out to the plant on a gray Thursday morning with a legal pad and a measuring tape. He hadn't been back in years. He didn't expect to feel anything in particular. He was wrong about that. Victoria Hale arrived at the plant that same morning with 4 members of her management team, a property assessor, and a photographer from a financial publication doing a feature on her restructuring strategy. She stepped out of the SUV in a charcoal gray suit and walked the length of the facility's exterior with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been to many such sites, and had never found any of them particularly interesting. One of her managers handed her a folder. She flipped through it quickly, asked 2 questions about the liquidation timeline, and then glanced across the parking lot to where Ethan was standing, with his legal pad, making notes about the dimensions of a loading dock. Her manager leaned in and mentioned the name. Cole Mechanical Repair, a one-man operation out of Delton Road. She looked at the file for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked up at Ethan. She walked over with her team, following at a measured distance. She introduced herself, though she clearly did not expect him to introduce himself in any way that would matter. She said, with the precision of someone choosing a scalpel over a hammer, that a facility of this scale required serious operational capacity, real infrastructure, the kind of resource base that a repair shop simply could not provide, and she would hate to see anyone waste their time pursuing something beyond their means. She was not shouting. She was not cruel in the theatrical sense. She was simply accurate. In her own estimation, the way mathematics is accurate. Clean. Final. Requiring no apology. A rundown shop like yours doesn't belong in a conversation about industrial-scale operations, she said. Her team maintained their expressions with the professional blankness of people who had learned that agreeing was easier than thinking. Ethan said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the plant. He looked at the loading dock he'd designed the drainage gradient for. He looked at the east wing where he'd spent 14 months calibrating a production line that had eventually run at 112% of its projected efficiency. Then he looked at Victoria Hale, with an expression that was neither anger nor hurt. It was something quieter and more permanent than either. "You just threw away something you don't understand the value of," he said. She looked at him for a moment, as if he had said something mildly eccentric, then turned and walked back toward her team. Ethan watched the convoy pull out of the parking lot. Then he went back to his notes. He hadn't started out as a repairman. The people in town who knew him only through the shop had no reason to guess otherwise. And Ethan had never felt the need to explain himself. But the truth of who he was sat in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of his workbench, under a stack of old invoices and a spare set of gloves. Inside that folder were blueprints, 47 pages of technical drawings, annotated in his own handwriting, for the production systems that had made the Hargrove plant one of the most efficient mid-scale manufacturing facilities in the region for nearly a decade. He had come to Hargrove straight out of a mechanical engineering program at 26, young enough to still be impressed by large machinery, and old enough to understand why most of it was being used badly. The plant's owner at the time, a deliberate and principled man named Donald Hargrove, had recognized something in Ethan that most employers only recognize in retrospect, that rare combination of theoretical precision and practical intuition that produces engineers who don't just design systems but understand them. Donald had given Ethan the latitude to redesign the plant's core production line. And over 5 years, Ethan had rebuilt it almost entirely. He hadn't used more, he'd used better, tighter tolerances, smarter sequencing, materials that cost less and lasted longer. The plant's output had increased by 31%, while its operational costs had dropped by 18%. Donald Hargrove had called him a magician. Ethan had called it paying attention. Then Claire got sick. It happened the way serious illness often does, not all at once, but in increments, each one slightly worse than the one before, until the increments stopped mattering and the whole picture became undeniable. Ethan had taken a leave of absence, then extended it, then made a decision that wasn't really a decision at all but a recognition of what mattered most. He stopped going in. Donald had held the position open for nearly a year. When it became clear that Ethan wasn't coming back, they had parted without drama, with mutual respect, and with a handshake that said more than either of them could have put into words. The repair shop had been a practical solution. He needed work he could control, hours he could set, jobs he could leave if Lily's school called, a space that was entirely his. He had rented the storefront on Delton Road for $800 a month, and built the business with the same patience he had once applied to machine calibration. It was smaller than what he'd done before. It was also, in the ways that counted, enough. But the blueprints stayed in the drawer. He didn't look at them often. Lily had found them once, spread on the kitchen table when he'd taken them out to check a measurement he half remembered. She had traced the lines with her finger and asked who had built the place in the drawings. He had told her it was someone who once had a very large dream. She had accepted this without question, the way children accept the things adults say when the adults sound like they are telling the truth about something sad. The auction listing for the Hargrove plant went up online 11 days after Victoria's visit. Ethan found it at 11:30 at night, after Lily was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and his laptop. The listing was terse and official: building, land, remaining fixtures, minimum bid. The number was low. Startlingly, almost insultingly low. Vantara wanted it off the books. They wanted it gone. The property had been assessed at a value nearly 4 times the opening bid. But assessed value and desperate value are different calculations entirely, and Vantara, for all its resources, was motivated by speed. Ethan stared at the number for a long time. Then he got out a sheet of paper and began to write. His friend Marcus, who ran an auto parts store 2 blocks from the repair shop and had known Ethan for 12 years, listened to the plan over a cup of coffee the next morning, and then set his cup down very carefully and said, "Ethan, you're describing spending everything you have on a building that hasn't run in months, in a market where you have 0 contracts and no distribution." Ethan said yes, that was roughly the situation. Marcus said, "And you think this is a good idea?" Ethan said he thought it was the only idea. Marcus looked at him for a long moment, and then said he'd help him move the equipment from the shop. The bank was less philosophical about it. The loan officer at the first institution was polite and precise in his rejection, citing insufficient collateral and no demonstrated revenue from the proposed operation. The second bank was faster and less polite. The third didn't return the call at all. Ethan had expected this. He had not, particularly, planned around it. What he had was what he'd accumulated: a truck, a set of tools that had taken him 15 years to build into a working collection, the savings account he'd been adding to since Lily was born, a small life insurance settlement he hadn't been able to bring himself to touch for 2 years. He liquidated all of it. The truck went to a buyer in the next county for $9,000. The specialty tools went at auction, carefully, one collection at a time, to people he trusted would use them properly. The savings account was transferred. When everything was counted, he was $2,000 short of the bid minimum, and he sat with that shortfall for 36 hours before Marcus arrived unannounced at the shop with an envelope and set it on the workbench, and said he didn't want it back before Ethan had made something worth paying back. Lily asked him, the evening before the auction, what would happen if it didn't work. They were eating pasta at the kitchen table, and she was twirling her fork in the careful, methodical way she had. And she looked at him over her plate with the direct gaze she'd always had, the one that Claire had also had, the one that didn't flinch from questions. He thought about giving her the reassuring answer. He chose the honest one instead. He said that if it didn't work, they would figure out what came next, and they would do it together. And the one thing he was certain of was that he didn't want to spend the rest of his life wondering what would have happened if he'd tried. She considered this. Then she nodded. Once, with the gravity of someone who has weighed something and found it acceptable, and went back to her pasta. He won the auction. The facility was his for a price that would have seemed reasonable as a rental for 2 years. He stood in the empty parking lot afterward with the paperwork in his hand and the keys to a building that hadn't been operational in months, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, not quite certainty, but something adjacent to it, purpose with weight to it. A direction that had mass. The workers found out through the same informal networks that small communities have always used. Word moved from one person's phone to another, then to a kitchen table, then to a group of men sitting in a diner who had worked the Hargrove line for between 7 and 22 years, and had spent the past weeks sending out resumes to companies 3 counties away. The first one showed up at the plant 2 days after the sale, a production line technician named Roy, who was 61 years old and had started at Hargrove at 39 and had never worked anywhere else. He stood at the gate and looked at Ethan and said he didn't need pay right away. Just something to do and somewhere to be. By the end of the week, there were 11 of them. By the end of the second week, 17. They came because they had nowhere else to go, and they stayed because of what Roy said to Ethan on that first afternoon, standing in the middle of the silent factory floor, with the afternoon light coming through the grimy skylights, and falling on machines that were coated in months of settled dust. Roy put his hand on a conveyor housing that he'd serviced 1,000 times, and he said, very simply, "If anybody alive can make this thing run again, it's you." The first thing Ethan did was turn on the lights. Not the production floor lights. The building's main electrical system needed inspection before it could handle the load, but a set of portable work lamps he'd carried in from the shop, placed at intervals down the length of the floor, throwing pools of yellow light into the gray. It was a small gesture, almost symbolic. But the workers who came in that first morning noticed it, and it changed something in the air of the place, the way a single fire changes a dark room. They began with assessment. Ethan moved through the facility with a clipboard and a flashlight, cataloging every machine, every joint, every seal. He had blueprints, he'd drawn himself, he knew this equipment the way a surgeon knows anatomy, but he went through the formal assessment anyway, because the honest condition of a machine is always more authoritative than any drawing. The conveyor systems needed belt replacements and bearing overhauls. The presses required hydraulic seal work and recalibration. The electrical control panels had suffered from the humidity of a closed building through 2 seasons, and several relay banks needed to be replaced entirely. It was a significant list. It was also a manageable one. They worked in shifts that weren't really shifts because no one was tracking hours. They arrived in the morning and worked until they couldn't, then slept on cots and folding chairs and one donated air mattress that someone had brought from home, and woke up and worked again. Ethan brought food, pasta and rice, and whatever was practical in bulk, and someone always made coffee, and the coffee was always terrible, and no one complained about it. The welding arcs cut blue-white through the dimness of the floor. The sound of metal being worked tapped, torqued, fitted, filled the building at hours, when the surrounding lots were silent. Machines that had sat inert for months began, one by one, to move. Ethan had not simply set out to restore the plant to its previous condition. He had spent the months between Claire's death and the shop's opening doing something that looked like grief from the outside, but was also, underneath, relentless thinking. He had been turning the old production systems over in his mind, the way a mechanic turns a part in his hands, feeling for the places where it wasn't quite right. And he had found them not failures, but inefficiencies, places where the original design had been constrained by what was available at the time, or by budget decisions that no longer applied. He had ideas, specific, technical, tested-in-theory ideas that he had never had the opportunity to implement. Now he did. The modifications he made were not dramatic. No single change was transformative on its own. But together, they amounted to a system that was quieter, faster, and more precise than the original. He redesigned the sequencing of 2 production stages, eliminating a buffering step that had always been a bottleneck. He replaced 3 pneumatic actuators with a hydraulic alternative that cost less per cycle and lasted longer between services. He reconfigured the conveyor speed ratios to reduce material stress during transfer, a change so small it was invisible to the eye, but measurable in the reject rate, which dropped from 4% to under 1% in early testing. While all of this was happening, Victoria Hale was in a conference room in a tower 40 miles away, signing a contract for a new partnership with a regional distribution company that her team projected would increase Vantara's industrial supply revenue by 11% over the next fiscal year. She had not thought about the Hargrove plant since the liquidation was finalized. She had certainly not thought about the man in grease-stained boots. She toasted the new deal with sparkling water because she didn't drink at business functions, and she moved on to the next item on her agenda, a contact within the purchasing department of a large industrial client, a company called Meridian Equipment. One of Vantara's steadiest accounts had quietly reached out to a former Hargrove worker, asking if the rumors about a new operation in the old plant were true. The former worker had passed the number to Ethan. Ethan had made the call. The first order from Meridian was modest, a production run of 1,200 precision coupling assemblies, a component they sourced routinely and had no particular reason to switch suppliers on. They placed it, as Ethan later understood, not because they expected anything remarkable, but because someone with institutional knowledge had vouched for the quality of the operation, and because the quoted price was 15% below what Vantara was currently charging for an equivalent unit. Ethan took the order, confirmed the timeline, and went back to the floor. The units shipped on schedule. All 1,200 of them. The rejection rate on delivery, was zero. Meridian's quality control inspector, a thorough and unsentimental woman named Dana Price, went through the batch with the unhurried precision of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and had learned to trust nothing on first impression. She found nothing to reject. She found, instead, a consistency of tolerance that she noted in her inspection report with a single adjective she used rarely: exceptional. Within the week, Meridian's procurement manager had called Ethan to discuss a larger order. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. A follow-up meeting was scheduled. Back on the plant floor, the evening the first payment cleared, Ethan gathered the crew in a loose semicircle near the main assembly station. He didn't make a speech. He handed out envelopes, the first wages any of them had received in months, and he said that this was the beginning, not the arrival, and that there was a great deal of difficult work still ahead, and he was grateful for every person in the room. Roy, who was not a man given to visible emotion, looked at the envelope in his hand, and then looked away at the far wall, and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was controlled but not entirely steady, that it had been a long few months. That was all. The room was silent for a beat. And then it wasn't silent anymore. It was the kind of sound that a space makes when people in it feel, perhaps unexpectedly, that they are somewhere they belong. Victoria Hale learned about it the way executives learn about competitive threats, through numbers that stopped making sense before the underlying cause became clear. The Meridian account had been steady for 4 years. A 7% decline in monthly volume was flagged by her financial team as an anomaly worth investigating. The investigation surfaced the name of an alternative supplier. The address of that supplier was run through a lookup system and returned a location that one of her analysts recognized: the former Hargrove facility on Carver Street in Delton County. The analyst delivered this information in a meeting with the careful neutrality of someone unsure how it would be received. Victoria looked at the address on the page in front of her for a long moment. Her expression did not shift perceptibly. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of something being held in careful compression. She said it was not possible that the facility had been in no condition to operate, that it had been divested at a distressed price, and that a one-man repair operation could not have brought it up to production standard in this time frame. Her head of operations said, very carefully, that the quality reports from Meridian suggested otherwise. Victoria said, "He's a mechanic." No one in the room said anything for several seconds. Then she told them to find out everything. The information arrived in segments over the following days, and each segment made the picture more complicated. Ethan Cole had not simply bought a building. He had rebuilt a production facility, a facility that he had, apparently, designed in the first place. His name appeared in Hargrove's engineering records from 9 years earlier, credited as lead systems designer on the Phase 2 production line, the line that had driven the plant's most profitable decade. He had left under personal circumstances, not professional ones. His departure had been documented with a personnel note describing him as one of the most capable engineers the company had employed. Victoria asked for the video archive next. There was, somewhere in the company's old media library, a recording from an industry conference where Donald Hargrove had showcased the Phase 2 line improvements. She found it without much difficulty, a 12-minute presentation from a trade event, filmed with the slightly unsteady camera work of a decade ago. The speaker for the first 8 minutes was Donald himself, describing the results. For the final 4 minutes, he introduced the engineer who had made it possible, and Ethan Cole, younger, with the particular energy of someone who genuinely loves what they are talking about, walked the audience through the design logic of the system with a clarity and enthusiasm that was entirely unrehearsed. He was not performing confidence. He had it the way people have it when they've done the actual work. Victoria watched the video twice. She did not show it to her team. She sat with it alone in her office, with the door closed, and she felt something she recognized, unwillingly, as a reckoning, not with Ethan Cole, but with the version of herself that had looked at a folder with the words Cole Mechanical Repair and a photograph of a small weathered storefront and drawn a complete conclusion in under 3 seconds. She thought about her father, who had known Donald Hargrove and had spoken of the plant with real respect. She had grown up in that business world, around people who built things with patience and precision, and somewhere in the years of acquisition strategies and efficiency metrics and press releases, she had stopped being able to see the difference between the number a thing produced and the thing itself. She put that thought away. She had a company to run, but she put it away less completely than she intended to. Meanwhile, Ethan was on the floor at 2 in the morning, alone with a machine that had been cycling inconsistently through a batch run. The client, a new one, a logistics equipment manufacturer out of the northern part of the state, needed the parts by the end of the week. The machine's control sequence had a timing irregularity that was producing a 3% dimensional variance, small enough to be invisible in basic inspection, but large enough to cause wear issues in application over time. Ethan had sent the rest of the crew home. He worked through the night with a diagnostic tool and a notebook, isolating the problem, tracing it back to a relay that was switching a fraction of a second late due to a voltage drop in its power circuit, and redesigning the control timing sequence to compensate. By 5 in the morning, the machine was running clean. By 6, he had Lily's breakfast made and her school bag packed, and a look on his face that Lily later described to her teacher as the face Daddy makes when he fixes something really hard. Victoria's counterattack arrived not as a confrontation but as a pressure system. A message passed through back channels to several suppliers. Ethan had begun working with a message that didn't name Vantara directly, but that carried the unmistakable weight of a large organization communicating its preferences. 2 suppliers changed their terms. 1 went silent entirely. Raw material costs on 2 critical components rose without explanation. An inspection notice appeared from a county regulatory office, citing a need to re-verify the plant's operational safety certificates, documentation that Ethan had filed properly and completely, but that would nonetheless require time and attention to navigate. Rumors moved through the industry's informal networks. The new operation was undercapitalized. The quality wasn't reliable under volume. There were pending compliance issues. None of it was true. All of it was plausible enough to make a procurement manager pause before signing a significant order. Ethan called a full meeting of the plant's workforce. Every person employed there, 43 people by that point, a number that still seemed remarkable when he counted it, stood in a rough gathering on the production floor, machines idle around them, the overhead lights casting the kind of light that makes people look serious. He told them exactly what was happening and exactly what he knew about it. He didn't soften it. He said the pressure was real, that it would cost them orders in the short term, and that he had no certainty about how long it would last or how damaging it would ultimately be. Then he said that if anyone wanted to leave, that if the uncertainty was too much, if there were better options available, he understood completely, and there would be no hard feelings and a reference letter for anyone who wanted one. He said he meant it. Then he waited. Not one person moved toward the door. Roy looked at the floor for a moment, then looked up and said that they'd all had better options before, and they'd chosen this, and that hadn't changed. A younger technician near the back, a woman named Carla, who had joined 3 weeks earlier after hearing about the plant from her brother-in-law, said that she'd rather stay and see how it ended. That was the general sentiment. He thanked them without being theatrical about it. He went back to his office and got back to work. The day after the full company meeting, the most senior engineer from Vantara's technical division, a man named Patrick Holloway, who had been with the company for 11 years and had been quietly miserable for the last 3, submitted his resignation. Victoria received the news of Holloway's resignation the same day she received the briefing on the national supply contract. The contract was enormous, a government-adjacent logistics infrastructure project, a 5-year deal that would represent the largest single revenue stream in Vantara's industrial supply division's history. The bidding process was formal, structured, and extremely competitive. Victoria's team had been preparing the submission for 6 months. She was confident. Confident was perhaps not a strong enough word. She had already begun drafting the internal announcement. Ethan had learned about the contract from Meridian's procurement manager, who had mentioned it in passing during a conversation about a separate order. He had gone quiet for a long moment, and then asked 2 questions about timeline and about submission format. He thanked the man and ended the call, and went and sat on a workbench for a while. Alone. Looking at nothing in particular. Then he called Roy in, and they talked for an hour. And then Ethan started writing. His submission was not, on paper, impressive in the way Victoria's was. Vantara's bid was a polished document representing the output of a full business development department, graphics, projections, client testimonials, a technical appendix that ran to 60 pages. Ethan's was clear, direct, and specific. It described the plant's actual output, its actual costs, its actual quality control data. It included the modifications he had made to the production systems and the measurable improvements those modifications had produced. It made no promises it couldn't keep, and no claims it couldn't demonstrate. It was, in short, the document of someone who had nothing to hide and no interest in pretending to be something he wasn't. The evaluation meeting was attended by a committee of 7 technical assessors, procurement specialists, and 2 senior administrators. Victoria presented Vantara's case herself, in person, with the command presence she had spent a career developing. She was, by any objective measure, a compelling figure in a presentation room. Her data was authoritative. Her projections were detailed. The committee asked questions. She answered them with precision and confidence. It was a strong performance. Ethan presented next. Midway through his presentation during a demonstration of his modified production sequencing system, run through a simulation on a laptop connected to a projector, the software integration that Vantara had built their technical demonstration around had a compatibility failure with the committee's system. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was visibly disruptive. And Victoria's technical liaison scrambled to correct it while the committee waited. The disruption lasted 9 minutes. 9 minutes of silence, of visible uncertainty, of a room full of careful people forming impressions. Ethan stepped forward. He asked if the committee would permit him to look at the issue. He spent 4 minutes at the laptop, not performing, not narrating, just working, and resolved the integration problem with a configuration workaround. The demonstration resumed. He finished his presentation without referring to what had just happened. He simply moved forward. But the committee had seen it. They had watched a man encounter an unexpected problem in a high-stakes environment and address it without visible distress, with the quiet competence of someone for whom problems are not crises but problems. The committee's questions for Ethan ran 17 minutes longer than scheduled. The contract decision was announced 3 weeks later. Ethan was in the middle of a production run when his phone rang. He stepped off the floor to take the call, listened, said thank you, and went back to work. He told Roy first, quietly, between 2 machines. Roy put his hand on the side of a housing unit and was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, as though something had been confirmed that he had privately believed for a long time. Victoria Hale received the decision the same way she always received bad news directly, from a person she had instructed to always tell her things directly. She listened without interrupting. She asked one question, then ended the call. She sat in her office for a period of time that her assistant later described as unusually long for a person who was normally never still. What followed was not sudden. It had the quality of something that had been building pressure for a long time and finally reached a threshold. The Meridian account had already shifted a significant portion of its purchasing. The loss of the national contract was visible. It landed in quarterly projections and made 3 board members call within 48 hours. The Holloway departure had not been the last. 4 engineers had followed him in the subsequent weeks, some to other companies, one directly to the plant on Carver Street. Suppliers who had been pressured into reducing their engagement with Ethan had, in several cases, quietly reversed those decisions when the outcome of the national contract became known. The calculus of risk had changed. The company's share price declined 11% over 6 weeks. The decline was not attributed publicly to any single cause. These things never are, but the internal analysis was less ambiguous. The restructuring strategy that had made Victoria's career, the clean, efficient, profitable machine she had built through acquisition and optimization, had a structural vulnerability that she had never factored into her models. She had optimized costs, and she had optimized processes, and she had optimized outcomes, but she had not found a way to optimize loyalty. The workers who had left when she cut the Hargrove plant didn't just take their labor elsewhere. They took their knowledge, their networks, and their 20-year understanding of a production system. Ethan Cole had turned that into a competitive advantage that her financial models had not predicted because her financial models had not known how to account for it. She flew to Delton County on a Thursday. She did not send an advance notice. She rented a standard car from the airport and drove herself, which she had not done in years, and she parked on Delton Road in front of the small repair shop with the faded sign and sat in the car for a few minutes before getting out. The shop was still there, still operating on reduced hours, managed now by Marcus, as a favor to Ethan. She walked around the side of the building and stood in the alley, where she had first glanced at the address in the file. It was exactly as small and unremarkable as she remembered it being. She stood there and felt the full weight of the distance between what she had seen and what had actually been there. Then she drove out to the plant. She did not go inside immediately. She stood in the parking lot, which was full now real cars belonging to real workers, and watched through the long windows of the facility as the floor ran at full capacity. The machines moved with the efficient rhythm of something well-designed, and the people moving among them had the ease of people who knew their work and trusted their equipment. She recognized faces. She recognized the shape of a production line she had reviewed in a quarterly report 2 years ago and signed off on shutting down. She found Ethan in the office at the side of the floor, reviewing specification sheets. He looked up when she came to the door and did not seem surprised to see her, which told her something. She said she needed to talk. He said to come in and sit down. She said what she had come to say, which was not an apology exactly. She was not a person who had a lot of practice with apologies, but it was something she had composed carefully, a recognition that her assessment of him had been incomplete and that the consequences of her decisions had been more significant than she had understood at the time. Ethan listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he didn't think the mistake she had made was about him in particular. He said he thought the mistake was in the method, in the assumption that a thing's value was fixed by how it presented itself, rather than by what it actually was. She said she thought that was probably right. Then she opened the briefcase she had brought with her and took out a document and put it on the desk between them. It was not a business proposal. It was a legal filing, a patent assignment document, returning to Ethan Cole full ownership of 3 industrial process patents that had been developed during his time at the Hargrove plant, and that had been, through a clause in his original employment contract, retained by the company upon his departure. Victoria's legal team had reviewed the clause. It was enforceable. She had chosen not to enforce it. The patents had not been the only reason for the plant's efficiency, but they were a significant component of what had made it distinctive. With full ownership restored, Ethan could license the technology directly, build it into proprietary systems, or simply use it as the foundation of operations that would be difficult for any competitor, including Victoria, to replicate without negotiating terms with him. He looked at the document for a long time. He did not pick it up. He said her name the first time, in their several encounters, that he had used it, and asked why. She said that her father had told her, years ago, that the measure of a leader was not how they treated the people who could do something for them, but how they treated the people they thought could not. She said she had failed that measure. She said she didn't imagine this fixed anything, but that it was the right thing to do, and she'd decided to do it. She got up to leave. She was near the door when he spoke. He said that if she ever wanted to build something again, something real, from the ground up, with people rather than over them, she knew where to find him. She paused in the doorway. She didn't turn around. She stood there for one moment that held more inside it than either of them could have named. And then she walked out through the plant floor, past the machines running their careful rhythms, past the workers who watched her pass with the neutral recognition of people who have survived something and come out the other side, and out through the main entrance into the late afternoon. The plant expanded over the following months with the steady logic of something built on a real foundation. A second production line was brought online, rebuilt from salvaged equipment and new components, incorporating the patented sequencing improvements that could now be openly used and built upon. Employment at the facility reached 112 workers by spring. There were waiting lists for positions not because the pay was spectacular, though it was competitive, but because the word that traveled through the county's labor networks was that the plant on Carver Street was a place where people were treated like they mattered, where the work made sense, and where the person running it had built everything he had out of nothing, twice. Ethan did not move out of the small house 2 streets from the shop. He still drove the same truck, now 15 years old, because it still ran, and he had never found a particularly compelling reason to buy a different one. Lily, who was now 9, and had recently developed a passionate and highly specific interest in marine biology, came to the plant on weekends and did her homework in the corner of his office, occasionally asking questions about what the machines were doing that he answered with genuine detail, because he believed strongly that real answers were better than simplified ones, regardless of the age of the person asking. On a Saturday in early spring, Ethan took Lily out to the plant in the early morning, before the Saturday skeleton crew arrived, when the building was quiet in the particular way that large spaces are quiet, full of presence and potential, but holding its breath. He turned on the floor lights. The machine stood still, waiting. The new sign above the production floor entrance, installed the previous week at Roy's suggestion by the workers themselves during an overtime evening that no one had requested compensation for, read in clean steel letters, Cole Industrial Systems. Lily stood next to him looking at it for a moment, her hands in her jacket pockets, her head tilted slightly the way it was when she was thinking something through. She asked if that was his name up there. He said it was. She asked if that meant he owned the whole thing. He said yes. She thought about this. Then she looked up at him and said it was a pretty big thing for someone who used to have a pretty small shop. He smiled, not the almost smile he kept for the workbench photograph, but a real one, and said that the shop wasn't small. It was just where it started. Victoria Hale left Vantara 6 months later. The board's dissatisfaction with the contract losses and the stock decline had been building, and the formal separation was described in the company's press communications as a mutual decision reached after a period of strategic reassessment. She took a 6-month pause, no board seats, no consulting, no public professional presence, a silence that people who knew her well found more surprising than any business outcome she had ever produced. She spent part of that time in a small office she rented, working through a set of questions she had been avoiding for years about what she was actually building and for whom and why. She read the engineering conference presentation from 12 years ago 3 more times. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who looked at something real and didn't see it. When she finally re-entered the professional world, it was not as a CEO. She joined the board of a small manufacturing incubator in the industrial corridor south of the city, an organization that provided capital and mentorship to first-generation business owners building things with their hands. She told the organization's director, on her first day, that she had recently come to understand something she should have understood much earlier, that the most valuable things are often found in the places that don't look valuable. The director, who had been told something of her history, said she supposed that was one way to get there. Victoria said she supposed it was. She did not call Ethan. She did not expect to. But on the morning the incubator featured a profile of Cole Industrial Systems in its newsletter, a brief, factual account of the company's growth and its significance to the regional employment base. She read it carefully, all the way through, and set it aside with a care that was perhaps more deliberate than the action required. The plant on Carver Street ran through the night, the way it always did now. The lights came on at 6 in the morning when the first shift arrived, and went off at 11 when the last machine was secured. From the road, through the long industrial windows, the interior was always visible, warm and lit and active. People driving past at different hours had begun to notice it, the way you notice a house that is always inhabited, always awake, always doing something. It had become, in the quiet accounting of the community around it, a fact of the landscape. A thing that was there. A thing that stayed. There is a particular kind of person who survives being underestimated, not by proving themselves to the people who underestimated them. Not by demanding recognition, but by simply going on and building the thing they knew they could build, with the patience and precision of someone who never needed permission to believe in their own work. The mockery does not disappear. The memory of it doesn't fade, but over time it becomes something different, not a wound but a reference point, a coordinate in the map of a life. The moment, just before everything changed. People will laugh at a man who stands in worn-out boots in front of a small shop between 2 abandoned buildings. They will look at the folder with his name on it and decide what he is in the time it takes to glance at a photograph. And sometimes they will be so completely wrong about what they are looking at that the full truth of it only becomes visible years later, standing in a parking lot full of cars, watching through the long windows of a building that was once theirs, watching someone else's lights on inside. You can dismiss a person for what they appear to be. You can drive away without a second thought. But some people don't need your belief to do what they came to do. Some people will simply wait for the moment when the thing they've been building is undeniable. And then they will let it speak for itself, and the echo of that will last long after the laughter has gone quiet, and the luxury car has turned a corner and disappeared. The factory was lit. The machines ran. Somewhere on the floor, among the workers who had chosen to stay when they didn't have to, Ethan Cole walked the line the way he always had, checking tolerances, noting irregularities, making adjustments, doing, in the end, exactly what he had always done, paying attention, doing the work, building something that would last.